Good evening. Welcome to historic Sotterley. For all of you present on site and those of you worldwide joining us on Zoom, I'm Scott Gray, the Executive Director, and we're pleased to have you joining us for Sotterley Presents People and Perspectives. Our guest this evening is Colonel Edna W. Cummings, U.S. Army retired. She's the author of A Soldier's Life, A Black Woman's Rise from Army Brat to 688 Champion, published by the University of Virginia Press. Colonel Cummings' works to bring recognition to the 688 Central Postal Directory Battalions, the all-black World War II Women's Army Corps unit. She championed the congressional effort to enact a Congressional Gold Medal Act in 2021 for members of the unit, and you can see the gold medal there. That is the nation's highest civilian honor. And she co-produced two documentaries about it. One, the 688, and another called Two Wars. Colonel Cummings is a distinguished alumnus of Appalachian State University and the Army ROTC program, followed by a distinguished 25-year military career that included assignments at Georgetown University, the Pentagon, and NORAD U.S. Northcom in Colorado Springs. She has a master's degree from Troy State University and a Master of Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College. Colonel Cummings was inducted into the Army Women's Foundation Hall of Fame and serves on its board of directors. Colonel Cummings received the 2022 NAACP's Jesse Brown Distinguished Leadership Award. The Center for Women Veterans selected her as the 2023 Trailblazer, and Zeta Phi sorority inducted her as an honorary member. In 2023, the U.S. Army War College Foundation honored her as an outstanding alumnus, and the Afro-American newspaper named her Person of the Year. She's a recipient of the 2025 Daughters of the American Revolution Medal of Honor and was recognized as a Mighty 25. She's held management positions and led Homeland Security and information technology initiatives for federal contractors, and she's currently Vice President of Windsor Group and an Army Reserve Ambassador for Maryland. Please join me in welcoming our very distinguished speaker, Colonel Edna Cummings.
Well, thank you so much for coming out. This is a beautiful location, my first time here, so thank you for having me. Before I get started, I'd like to show a short video about the 688 to kind of ground you in the story and why this history matters. So with that, please show the video. It's about 6 minutes long, so I hope you enjoy it.
In July 1944, Allied forces broke out from Normandy following the D-Day landings of 1 month before. American troops began their march across France, liberating Paris and making their final push into Nazi Germany. As fighting intensified, so did the need for reminders of who and what they were fighting for. Letters and packages were the connections to loved ones and to their lives at home. But as the American army spread across Europe, delivery of mail became ever more difficult. 7 million Americans, military and civilian, were stationed in the European theater. Most were changing locations often, and many soldiers shared common names. By Christmas 1944, 17 million pieces of mail had piled up in Birmingham, England. Packages of cakes and cookies rotted in warehouses, while the troops shivered on the front lines of France and Belgium. The soldiers noticed, and Army reports noted the lack of reliable mail was hurting morale. A new mail delivery system was needed, and it would be managed by a new unit, fresh from the States, and ready to prove themselves up to the task. On February 3rd, 1945, the first group of women from the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion shipped out from New York. The 6888 was the first Army unit of its kind, consisting entirely of African American women. It was under the command of Major Charity Adams, the first Black woman to earn a commission in what would become the Women's Army Corps. Arriving in Birmingham, the women of the 6888 were met with unheated warehouses stacked to the ceiling with letters and packages. Immediately, they got to work, splitting into shifts and working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They tracked the locations of millions of troops and had the solemn duty of returning mail addressed to service members who had died. All the while, the stacks of undelivered mail began to shrink as the 6th AAA adopted the motto, "No mail, low morale." And yet they still found themselves having to prove their worth to their fellow Americans. During an inspection by an Army general, Major Adams was chastised for not having all her troops present. She explained that the women worked in shifts and that she was following orders as she was given, but was cut off. The general threatened to send a white officer to show her how to command the unit. "Over my dead body, sir," she replied. Major Adams remained commander of the 6th AAA, clearing the 6-month backlog of mail in less than half that time. Their mission in England complete, the 6th AAA transferred to France in June 1945, where they faced a similar stockpile. Once again, it was cleared in half the time expected. While in France, the 6th AAA felt the same loss as so many American units during the war, as 3 women, PFC Mary Barlow, PFC Mary Bankston, and Sergeant Dolores Brown, were killed in a Jeep accident. They would be buried with honors alongside their brothers in arms at the Normandy American Cemetery. Only 4 women would be buried in Normandy. 3 were from the 6th AAA. By late 1945, the war now over, American troops began their long-awaited trek home. Among those heading home was the general who had threatened to replace Major Adams. Since that encounter, they had developed a good working relationship, and just before leaving, he showed up unannounced. "Adams, I've received my orders to return to the States," he told her. "It's not easy for me to say what I've come to say. Working with you has been quite an education for me, especially about Negroes. It's been a long time since anyone challenged me, black or white, but you took me on. You outsmarted me, and I am proud that I know you." Charity Adams would be promoted to lieutenant colonel, the highest-ranking African-American woman in the Army at the time. The remainder of the 6th AAA would return home to a still segregated country in February 1946 and be disbanded without further ceremony. 855 women served with the 6th AAA during World War II. They were the only battalion of all African-American women to serve abroad during the war. The example they set proved an education for a great many, opening the door for generations of servicewomen since.
Ladies and gentlemen, the surviving women of the 6th AAA Central Postal Directory Battalion. Ms. King, what do you want Americans to remember about the women that served with you in the 6th AAA?
We wanted to do our part in serving our country to make people realize that we too loved our country.
Absolutely. Mrs. Ruddock, what was the most rewarding part for you in serving with the 6th AAA?
The most satisfying part of my career was knowing that we did the job as requested, and we did it in record time, and we moved on.
Absolutely did your job. Yeah. I'm curious to know, what does it mean for the 6th AAA to finally be receiving the recognition they deserve after 75 years?
It was quite a surprise. We had gone about our duties and marriage and making our lives. It's quite wonderful to know that people really cared.
I think it's a great thing, but I truly, truly regret the fact that it boils down to 7 of us to receive the gratification when there were so many who gave their lives. And we take the vote of the time.
Ladies and gentlemen, the surviving veterans of the 6th AAA.
You okay? Yeah, that was in 2019. At the time, there were 7 women still alive, and now there's 1 Major retired Fannie McClendon, who lives in Arizona, and she turns 106 this year. And what was interesting about her, when she came back from the war, she went to the recruiting stations because women could join the military again. So she was on her way to the Army recruiter, and the Air Force recruiter got her. And she ended up retiring from the Air Force. And in Dayton, Ohio, we were able to get a panel about her service with the 6888 as their bridge, because I don't think there are any Air Force people in here. The Air Force was part of the Army at one time. So that's a great story. And that was, again, in 2019 at an event called the American Valor Awards, hosted by the American Veterans Center, the same organization that hosts the National Memorial Day Parade. And on the stage, you saw the camera with three women, and there was a lady in the gold on the far left. That was Indiana Hunt Martin. Yeah, so just to kind of put, a name with the face. But again, thank you for, you okay? I'm not going to look at you. So thank you for this opportunity just to share my thoughts. For a while, all of these stories, like, oh, that's great history. It's a part of American history that we didn't know about. But once I began in 2018, I've been at this for about 8 years now, I realized it was now part of my heritage. And as I mentioned, for the past 8 years, I've been researching and reflecting on the challenges and impacts of African American women on the military and in society as a whole. In other words, what happens to these women when they came back from the war? As you saw on the video, they just went about their lives without any recognition. And the story struck home to me because I'm a military brat, Army brat to be specific. And my father was a World War II occupation force veteran who served in Italy during 1947. He just passed last year at 98. So I would listen to his stories, and he served in Korea on peacekeeping missions, in Japan, 2 tours of Vietnam, and of course, wherever else the 82nd Airborne sent him. So when I was in high school, I remember seeing something in a newspaper that women could join Army ROTC, and I thought about it because living on military bases, the women just seemed so sharp and confident, and they seemed happy. I'm like, okay, I think I can do that. It was something different, but he did not want me to join the Army, not at all. He said, absolutely not. And it's one of those conversations I had to say, but Dad, I can go to college and become an officer. And he's like, what? And I didn't realize that he didn't understand the path that I was on because it was non-negotiable. You are going to college. But once I joined, I now better understand his concerns after learning about the 6888, because realizing the era that he served, 1947 when he went in, 1946 actually, and then, started touring in 47, he was probably sure that I would not receive the respect and dignity as a woman, especially as a Black woman, because he had a front row seat to President Truman's Women's Armed Service Integration Act that occurred in June 1948, and the subsequent Executive Order 9981 that required equality of treatment and opportunity for all personnel in the armed services. And actually the start to desegregate the armed services, but it really didn't happen. Desegregation didn't happen until, years later. And then I realized that the Women's Army Corps was not disbanded until 1978. 1978, 4 months after I was on active duty. So yes, for a while I was a WAC. I was in the Women's Army Corps. My orders said, Second Lieutenant Edna Cummings, assigned to the Women's Army Corps, but detailed to the active Army. So to put things in perspective regarding equality for women and in the military, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act did not pass until 1974. And that legally enabled women to apply and hold credit cards. So my freshman year in college was the first year that women could hold credit cards in their own name without a male cosigner. And so reflecting in context of the military, Women have served this nation formally since 1942, but actually 1943, because in 1942, women served but without benefits, and it wasn't until 1943. But that meant from 1943 until 1974, when women traveled and served Vietnam or wherever they were serving, these women could not hold credit cards. And for veterans in the audience, you know how important it is to be able to have some type of credit card with the constant moving and reassignments and just life, because we depend on our credit cards probably more than we should, but you know, it's a fact of life now. And so when I came on active duty in 1978, I slowly began to understand why my father objected to me serving when one of my troops approached me, and he was a private, and he didn't know what to do. He didn't know whether to salute. I'm like, okay, you know, second lieutenant. I'm like, okay, you know, private unit salute. What's your problem? You know, I'm ready to do what officers do, especially second lieutenants. He said, I didn't know they made y'all. I'm like, true story. I'm like, y'all, like there's this, you know, assembly line of Black women officers. He had never seen a Black woman officer. And so when I began to research and advocate for the 6888, and my goal was public education, and I just noticed that that was a part of military history that was missing, the service of not only just women, but especially Black women, because looking at any World War II movie, you see women represented, and they're nurses. We've had, you know, nurses in all wars, and there were Black women nurses in World War I and World War II. But in all of the movies, they were always depicted as a love interest or waiting for somebody to come back home. They were never really in an operational role outside of a traditional role of nursing or just the love interest of, you know, the star of the show or whatever. So once I researched the 6888 and became involved in the advocacy, my goal was to have the 6888 to receive the same recognition as other storied units from World War II, the Harlem Hellfighters, the Tuskegee Airmen, and other units that have received recognition. And a lot of people had not heard about the 6888. I hadn't heard about the 6888. But the more I learned about their history, I realized that their history and legacy was so much more. It was now my heritage. It's something that can be passed on from one generation to the other, and something that can be conserved or inherited, and it has a historical cultural value. And that was our challenge when we advocated. I'm not a lobbyist, but I did lobby Congress, meaning I knocked on doors when we advocated for the Congressional Gold Medal, because the Congressional Gold Medal is the nation's highest civilian award. And what that medal means, and there's a replica of it, you know, as you walk in the door, it means that this individual, institution, organization has made an impact on the culture and fabric of the United States. And that was our goal. But the legacy and heritage and the impact of women's service, not just the 6888, is still relatively new. The people who are not in uniform, so many civilians, enable the military to perform its mission in the community and support veterans and their families. And you have a lot of women who are part of that role. You had the Donut Dollies in World War II. You had Rosie the Riveters who served at home. And all of these were diverse women's organizations. They were not in the military, but the military cannot do anything without the women. And so a lot of the legacy and heritage of women's military serving in or with the military is still being shaped. And I was just wondering, why is it that no one really talked about what women did until recently? And a lot of it's because of the generation that we're in now. We have the opportunity to have these conversations. We have the platforms. But a lot of veterans, male and female, just didn't talk about their service. They didn't want to relive it for a lot of reasons, a lot of trauma, a lot of just unpleasant experiences. And women's military history has always been a slight mention and more of a footnote. And especially during World War II, a lot of women who served were not necessarily embarrassed, but they rather not tell people they were in the military because of the stereotypes. After all, why would a self-respecting woman want to work around a lot of men and wear pants and do these male-type jobs? And then I had to pause for a moment and think. I remember doing the exact same thing because when I went in the Army, when I did, people would ask me, "Oh, what do you do?" I would say I work for the federal government because I did not want to have those conversations. Well, what's it like working around all those men? Or you must be, I could hear the stereotypes. And unless I was in an environment with other military women or people who understood the military, I didn't do it either. I didn't share my story. And so what's interesting, this year, 2026, marks the 250th anniversary of America's independence. And we know that since the Revolutionary War, that women have always embraced the ideals of patriotism and democracy without being drafted. Women have never been drafted. They've always been, volunteers. Women have always volunteered. And they fought racial and gender battles with the tools they had. And what were those tools? It was intellect and just showing people what they could do instead of telling them, because sometimes the conversation, fell on deaf ears. And so we have women of color, Phyllis Sweetley, who started writing poetry, Grace Wisher from Maryland at 13. She was an indentured servant in the home of flag maker Mary Pickersgill of Baltimore. And she worked along that group of women to sew the Star Spangled Banner. So all of these stories about contributions of women and women of color just were not told. And recognizing the contributions of these women, again, still happening, and just thanks to Governor Wes Moore and Major General Janine Burkhead in Maryland, Harriet Tubman finally received military honors as a brigadier general. So she is now General Harriet Tubman. And that happened a couple of years ago in 2024. And even post-Civil War, after Harriet Tubman, we had Kathy Williams, who disguised herself as a man to serve with the Buffalo Soldiers. So women have always really, really found a way to serve, even when society would not allow them the formal opportunity. But what I'd like to do is delve a little bit deeper into like some of the other service of women, beginning with World War I. And with the women's service and my service in the military, I said, this is far more than history. These are women who did so much so that people like me could serve. And beginning with World War I, we had World War nurses who served in World War I. There were 18 Black nurses in World War I. And I always thought that since I was in the Army was the front runner with women serving in the military, beginning with World War II, because they had benefits. But I learned, I'm in Navy territory, I know this, there was a group of women called the Golden 14. These were Black women who filled clerical positions with the muster roll personnel in World War I. And after World War I, they were released for active duty. So they were the first Black female non-nursing women in the military. So I have to defer to my Navy counterparts and thank you for the opportunity. And in World War I, there was a group of women called the Hello Girls who recently received the Congressional Gold Medal. Now, the Hello Girls were AT&T operators working in the United States, and General Pershing said, "Hey, I need help overseas." So he sent like 212 women, and they volunteered to put the calls through for General Pershing. But when they came back from the World War I, the Army said, well, the military said you were never soldiers, and they didn't get veteran status until 1977. I know. So, I mean, there's a consistent pattern here with women's service. And so during World War II, the entire nation, mobilized to support a three-theater war. You had the Pacific Theater, the European Theater, and the China-Burma-India Theater, the Forgotten Theater. And it was true then and true now that the military relies on the civilian community. And so First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt in World War II and Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune worked together to ensure women, and especially Black women, had the right to serve, because African Americans were denied the right to be in combat units. And the Black women said, well, we allow you to serve, but we're going to give you a 10% quota. So with that 10% quota, and the first class of Black women to join the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was an individual, Charity Adams. And we'll talk a little bit more about Charity Adams, but more than 7,000 Black women served in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the Women's Army Corps during World War II. And in 1942, it was the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, meaning all women could serve, but without benefits. But in 1943 became Women's Army Corps, and the women, could use benefits. And that also gave rise later on to the WAVES, the Navy Women's Auxiliary Volunteer Service, and the Coast Guard in 1944. But the Army did lead the way in that regard. And what I learned, what was fascinating with the women who actually served in uniform, not as volunteers or auxiliary, the women had to have high school diplomas. The men did not. I know. And because just think, 42, we really got involved, in the war, 41, 42. And this was post-Depression, the Great Depression. So the literacy levels in the US were less than 40%, meaning only about 35, 40% of Americans had high school diplomas. So it's interesting that hundreds of thousands of men had to sign draft registration with an X because they could not sign their own names. But for women to join, they had to have high school diplomas. So the women had to be more educated. And so that was something. So just hold that thought. I'll come back to the educational level of women. This includes all women, because we had women, the Black women, women from Puerto Rico. We had women, they called the Nisei women, who served in World War II. Regardless of the race, women had to have a high school diploma or equivalent, and the men did not. And during that time, we had 600,000 Rosary Rivers and about 10,000 civilian cryptographers called Code Girls. And studying the Code Girls, you must be in crypto, because a lot of people don't know who those are. It had about 10 Black women who were recruited as cryptographers, but that's a lost part of history, because these women had to tell everyone, hey, we're secretaries. They're classified missions. They could not talk about their service. So I've spoken with Liza Mundy, who wrote the book Code Girls. And so she really brought that story to the forefront. But that's another hidden history, regarding women's military service. Right here in Maryland, we had the first Black female certified war correspondent. Her name was Betty Murphy. Her father was a publisher for the Afro newspaper. And so there's a book on the table back there. It's called This Is Our War, where the Afro newspaper sent 7 journalists throughout the various theaters of war, and they wrote what was going on, the first embedded reporters, if you would, to cover the stories of the Black serving, because mainstream media wasn't covering that story. And so now the Afro newspaper, based in Maryland, is one of the primary sources, along with a few other papers of the Black press, for African American military history. And what's interesting about these embedded journalists, they were all assigned the rank as captain, to include Betty Murphy. And so what's interesting, World War II is called the greatest generation for a reason, I think, because in 1941, there was a Army Air Corps Black woman who worked at Maxwell Air Force Base. She was a seamstress, and Maxwell Air Force Base is in Montgomery, Alabama. She was a seamstress at the field house. And she later became the civil rights icon because when she got off work, while she was at Maxwell, she could ride the bus around Maxwell Air Force Base. But when she got to the gate to Montgomery, Alabama, she says, why can't I ride this bus? So that's seamstress Rosa Parks. So my point is the military and the civilians and personnel of all races, especially the women, have used the military and the support to the military as a platform to advocate for social justice and fair treatment. So back to 1942, I told you there was a quota on the Black women who could serve in the military, 10%. So the first class in 1942 to join the Women's Army Corps, Women's Army Auxiliary Corps without benefits, 440 women were selected to become officers, train the officers first and then bring on the enlisted. 35,000 women applied for 440 slots, and it was 40 Black women, 39 attended, 36 graduated. And one of those women was Charity Adams. So Charity Adams graduated with 36 other Black officer candidate schools, from Fort Des Moines, Iowa. And during World War II, about 6,500 went through the training to become either officers or enlisted personnel. And they worked throughout the U.S. in various locations, Fort Bragg, Fort Des Moines, Academy in Kentucky, wherever these military bases were. And so what's interesting, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune was also an honorary general in an organization called the Women's Army for National Defense, this paramilitary group of women who just said, we are going to make sure our Black troops are taken care of. I mean, they had this military structure. She was a 4-star, she had a 3-star, and they had an inspector general. But so they advocated for Black women to serve overseas, but they had to be in meaningful roles, because within the U.S., what's interesting is that the women in the military, the Black women, even though they were trained for certain jobs, a lot of them were not able to perform these jobs. They were relegated to menial tasks. And I know when I started working with the 688, my mother said, check and see if one of my friends was in the 688, because I know she was in the military. And so this lady was a missionary sister from my mother's. They would go to the same church. She would come to our home. And so I looked up Miss DeVetta. And Miss DeVetta had enlisted in the military. But what I learned, Miss DeVetta had been put in confinement at Camp Breckenridge because she refused to flip bed springs. And so this nice little church lady of my mother had been put in a military confinement because she refused to do menial tasks. And then I started digging deeper. There was a court case in Massachusetts at the hospital, Lowell Hospital. These women went on strike. There's a great book by Sandra Bozelius called Glory in Their Spirit about the strike, where these women were trained as medics, these Black women, but they were being used as orderlies, just changing bedpans because the hospital commander didn't think they should work in their roles. And so they went on strike. It was a huge case. NAACP got involved, and the women were later exonerated. But just delving deeper, we heard of Black troops coming home from the war, being beaten and in prison. The same thing happened to Black women. They were beaten while in uniform, 3 in Kentucky. They were being slapped and harassed. And so that part of the military history in terms of, forget about the 6 AAA for a moment, but just for Black women's service. And that's why I said that's part of my heritage, because that's what these women went through to make it possible for someone like me to serve. But with the efforts of these women who's just standing up and in the U.S. fighting for the right to serve, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, said it's time for Black women to go overseas. But they need to go overseas in meaningful roles. I mean, the stereotypes and rumor has started about some of the options for the women as they went overseas, but the goal was to have a meaningful role. So in February of 1945, this group known as Romeo Tango 510C, RT 510C, deployed to the European Theater of Operations. Didn't have any idea of what the mission was, but women said, all right, who wants to go overseas? And these women include Janice's mother in the back, volunteered, we want to go. And they had no idea what the mission was, but they just want the opportunity to prove, instead of telling everybody what they could do, they wanted to prove it. And so what's interesting is that 85% of the women who were handpicked for the 6 they had to undergo psychological testing. They had to undergo training at Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia for 2 weeks, overseas training, so they learned how to navigate ropes. How many of you seen the 6 movie? Okay, so that's based on a true story, but that scene where they're training, that wasn't their basic training, that was actually overseas training, and the unit did not become the 6 too much later. But that movie captured the essence of the story, because the women, the 855 women that were selected, had to undergo all this training just in case they had to get off the ship, just in case they came under fire, because they were going into a combat environment. But they were not trained mail clerks. And so when the U.S. had gone overseas right after Pearl Harbor, the mail problem began because D-Day was a catalytic battle, but it didn't end the war. The war was still happening, and so with mail, it was stopped deliberately, it was censored, and sometimes the vehicles had to be allocated for other missions instead of mail getting mailed to the front line. So those of you who have served, or just even now, looking at your phone, maintaining that connection with someone you love, that was broken for over 2 years. So you had troops on the front line who hadn't received mail. White wax had gone overseas to try to solve the problem. You had white male units that tried to solve the problem. So you had this, technically it was an experiment. Okay, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, you said you have this group of Black women. Prove to me that these Black women can get it done. And that's exactly what it was. It was an experiment. But 85% of the 6 again, they all had high school diplomas, so they were in the top, percentile of education. But 85% were either college graduates or former school teachers. So you had the best and brightest in the nation. And Charity Adams, triple major in math, Latin, and physics at Wilberforce University. She graduated from high school at 16, and she was in graduate school in vocational psychology at The Ohio State, as I've been corrected, when she was tapped by Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune to lead this unit. And so in my mind, in my book, I talk about this. Wait a minute, she had a major in physics and math, vocational psychology, so she knew how to make people perform. She knew how to maximize output. So I said, in the back of her mind, she probably didn't know at the time, she was some type of engineer, systems engineer, maximizing throughput. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, but what's interesting, she was only 26 years old, leading 855 women as a battalion commander. Now, battalion commanders now have been in the military about 15 years, and they're in their 40s probably. Lieutenant colonel size, 855 of personnel. So she was at 26, equivalent to what a 40-year-old, 40-plus-year-old is doing now. And it wasn't just Army mail, because I was in the Army, and I know that the Army is the executive agent. Basically, they're in charge of the mail for everyone. So Air Force, Navy, Marines, wherever you are, if you're overseas, the Army's in charge of your mail. So she was handling mail for everyone. And what you saw in the video, that's actual footage from World War II, showing how the mail was stacked. And so what's also interesting about the 6888, not only were they educated, it was a group of Black women, but some of the women could choose if they wanted to be Black or white. Because you had women from Puerto Rico, one woman, Crescencia Garcia, she was Puerto Rican when she came to the U.S. It was the summertime, she was dark. And so they assigned to a Black unit. And then when she got to Europe, her tan had faded. It's okay, you can go work as a medic. And I talked with the lady who I mentioned, Major McClendon. She said, yeah, they would take our women if they could pass for white, and they would work in other places. But then there was another woman, her father was Black, her mom's from Mexico. And they said, well, what unit do you want? Are you going to go with the Black unit or the white unit? So Lydia Thornton decided to join the Black unit. So it was just interesting to hear how literally, not race, but skin color was a driver for a lot of the personnel decisions with the 6888. So other, ethnicities served women. You had about 200 Puerto Rican women, to include Crescencia Garcia. You had second generation immigrant, the Japanese American women, known as Nisei women. But these translators, interpreters, nurses, and the non-6888 women, they all say, we want to serve. We want the opportunity to prove that, number one, we are loyal, we are vested in this country, we want to take care of our brothers, our uncles, and our family members. They want to do their part for the war. So by the end of World War II, more than 300,000 women had served either in or with the armed forces, and over 300,000 in or with 150,000 in the armed forces. But with the armed forces, you had the Waves, the Coast Guard, just these auxiliary type units who were not technically in the military, but they put the uniform on everyone. And so fast forward, you're in World War II, and so some of these women stayed on with the 6888. They stayed on and served, within the military, after that. And so throughout the nation's wars, and that's the way I talk about, the 6888 in context of the foundation that they set not only for my service, but for subsequent, women and women of color to serve. And with the 6888, people say, oh, they paved the way for women. I'm like, they paved the way for more than women, because these women had sons. And I've talked to the sons and grandsons of these women who served because of their family member, who was a woman. So it's just not about what they did for women, it's what they did for the nation and people in general. So fast forward to the other wars, and I was curious about the service of women, Black women, from Vietnam and the Korean War, and there were Black women who served in the Korean War. And there was I learned about, not heard about her, Major Lieutenant Cohen. She just died in 2025. She was the first Black Army nurse, and she later joined the Air Force, and she was overseas during World War II. The first Black woman in the Marines was someone named Annie Graham, and that wasn't until 1949. And my dad served 2 tours in Vietnam, and you all have heard about the Tet Offensive. And what's interesting, I stumbled upon this specialist. Her name was Doris Lucky. And she was a member of the Women's Army Corps, and she was an intel analyst. And she says, hey, about 50,000 Chinese troops are building up to attack. And she was ignored. And that later became the Tet Offensive. And so she is now recognized within the military intelligence community. So my point is, you've had women who served and who weren't always listened to, but they made such an impact on our nation. And we're just now realizing the impact. Fast forward, we have, women serving in the Gulf War. It wasn't until 2016 where women could serve unrestricted. So in closing, I just want to reflect with regards to heritage and history. How could these women serve when their nation wouldn't serve them? I mean, that's a question that was asked then. It's a question asked now. How can you serve a nation that doesn't serve you? And I have a picture of, you heard, Lena King. By the way, she is the one featured in the 6888 movie. That's her story, who you heard speak. But back on the table, you see a picture of Millie Bailey. And Millie Bailey served during World War II, and she actually lived in Maryland and died not too long ago. She was a WAC. And I'd read where she was spat at while in uniform. And I think it was the 14th of May, Howard County dedicated a park in her honor. The Veterans Park is right next to the Whole Foods if you go there. And I said, well, I read that someone spat at you while you were in uniform. I said, what did you do? She says, nothing. And she said, I remember the kindness. And she would tell stories how when she was on the train, there was this general, everybody was waiting for the general to come off the train. And the general said, you go first, this white general. So she went first and everybody was clapping and everything. And he was back in the back laughing because he wanted her to have some of that dignity. And so she said, I remember the kindness, and the kindness far outweighed anything negative that anyone could do for me. And it was a lot. But as Ms. King said, the veterans all said, we wanted to fight for our nation. We believe in democracy, but we want to fight for ourselves. And we want to prove that we belong, and this was our, country. And so that was just something, I'm like, wow, I wish I would have known that when I was on active duty, because I didn't learn about the 6888 until probably 2015, 2016. I didn't know. I had no idea. And so that's, interesting that these women who went through so much, and they all volunteered. And not a one of the 6888 women I talked to had any remorse. They were excited. They were treated better overseas than they were treated within the U.S. But what they did, they used that experience overseas as a platform and came back and just did wonderful things for the community. Janice's mother, we got the Congress to approve the 6888 Congressional Gold Medal. We actually got Congress to agree, but Congress also agreed on naming a post office in honor of Janice's mother in Buffalo, New York. That required signature, the president's signature. We were able to get one named for Miss Millie Veazey from North Carolina. Miss Veazey came back, and a lot of these women used the GI Bill when they came back from the war. Miss Veazey from North Carolina used the GI Bill and got her undergraduate degree, got a master's, and she became a civil rights advocate. Dr. King, when he came to North Carolina, stayed at her sister's house. She marched with him and just did so much for the community because they knew what was possible by defeating the stereotypes and the odds from World War II. So I think that's just, a great lesson in resilience and just giving yourself a chance and instead of talking about it, just doing it. So I spoke with the Secretary of Maryland's Veteran and Military Families. And he's new, Secretary Rothstein. If you ever get a chance to get him, down here, please invite him. He'd love to come. And I asked him, I says, what message do you want me to share with the veterans as I talk about the 6888 and the impact? And he says, I want people to know, let's go beyond, the ceremonies and the awards. Let's just make sure we take care of our veterans. Make sure that the caregivers are taken care of within the state of Maryland. Make sure that we help veterans apply for assistance. So that's huge. We have so many 6888 veterans I talked to. They didn't feel welcomed at the VA. So as a result, they lost out on years of entitlements and benefits. And I actually helped some to connect with services, toward the end. And that was kind of disheartening. But now that we know the resources are there, I just encourage you to do that. And then in terms of heritage, record your stories. Every veteran's story is a piece of military history. And I think about Antiques Roadshow, those hidden treasures in the attic. Families have hidden histories that the family members don't talk about them or what they experienced unless they're asked. And since Janice is here, I talk about her mom. And the more she talked, the more Miss Hunt Martin remembered. Because Miss Indiana, we'd take her place, she says, am I supposed to start talking now? And every time she talked, more and more came out because nobody ever asked. And so veterans, you can record your family members' history in the Library of Congress. If you have veterans in your family, there's a great information kit. You can just go online, interview the veteran, and submit it to the Library of Congress, oral histories or written. The Women's Memorial, we encourage women to register their service there. And in our 6888 documentary, Miss Indiana is in the documentary. She just had a Ziploc bag full of stuff. And Janice thought it was junk too, but all this junk, she had a jewelry box from a POW that she worked alongside when she was in France. So that's now on display at the World War II Museum in New Orleans. She had all of these artifacts that helped pull together some missing pieces about the 6888. And I mentioned my father died last year. I'm going through his records and I'm looking at stuff, even though we talked a lot about what he did when he was in the military, I'm still learning. So I just encourage you to just tap into your own legacy. It doesn't have to be military. There's some great stories there. And in closing, again, and this is the third time I said in closing, so I'm going to really stop talking now. But thank you for this opportunity, and I appreciate it. And I'll just take some questions now if anyone has any questions about the 6888. And I will have, my book for sale where I talk about not only the 6888, but just, a few other experiences I had while I was on active duty, along with those of my father and my late husband who served on the DMZ in Korea, and that was interesting. Yes, ma'am.
See, I'm okay. I speak. Oh, okay.
Okay.
My name is Yolanda Christensen, and first of all, thank you very much for educating me today. There's a lot that I didn't know.
Oh, thank you.
And it's true, the world is very small. However, my name of my company is Benevolent Art LLC, and I am looking for ways to support caregivers. And you mentioned as far as how we can give back to our veterans. And I host small events to give back. No payments, just to give back. Are there opportunities as far as volunteering with what you're speaking about as far as supporting the veterans?
Well, I don't know of, there are a lot of nonprofits and organizations who support veterans, but I encourage you to reach out to the Department of Maryland's Veterans and Military Families and speak with them, because Rosalind Jones does the women. You have Jimmy Anderson who does the families and veterans, and you have somebody for the military, and they really connect. And I can give you, that information. And for caregivers, there's a program within Department of Veterans Affairs for caregivers. There's a huge network. Families, if you are a caregiver for a veteran, the veteran has a certain disability rating, you can connect with those services, and there's a huge network that they offer that a lot of people don't know about. So I encourage you to tap in, to those resources as well, but I'll share that information with you. Sure.
So we have 3 questions
Okay.
online. One is, how long on average did the women in the 688 serve?
Yeah. The women that I've researched, the majority served, I would say, about 2 to 3 years. We had some who just came in to serve with the 6888, and then some had joined prior to the 6888, not just to go overseas, but just to serve. And so it varied, but the majority, they were not career military. A lot of them got off, discharged right after the war. So I would say about 2 to 3 years.
The second question we have is, were troops segregated overseas at that time?
Yes. Now, what's interesting with the segregation is that a lot of the Black troops were not considered combat units. They were support roles, but combat is not linear. Bullets don't discriminate. They don't care race, gender, bullets and artillery don't discriminate. But yes, the units were segregated, and there are some very storied Black units from World War II, Moffett Point Marines. You have a member of the 6888 who actually married a member of the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers. So you have a lot of storied units, Tuskegee Airmen. So yes, the units were segregated.
The third question is kind of directed towards Janice, if you're okay. So Sotterley has a very vibrant descendants community that plays a major part of the work and the mission that we do. And people are wondering, what has your journey been like uncovering and preserving your mom's story?
Good question.
It's been really fascinating. I lost my mom in 2020, and she was able to be a part of the whole process before she passed. But I have learned and I have been discovering who my mom was before she was my mom, which many of us, I have found out, do not know who our parents were before they were our parents. And I found she's had a very fascinating life before she became my mom, and even after, though. But I have just really enjoyed, and I am so thankful to Edna for turning me on to getting involved and starting to talk about my mom other than just being my mom. But it has really been a wonderful journey, and I advise everyone to please check with your family, find out your stories, find out their stories. Don't wait till it's too late.
Thank you for the talk. It was
Oh,
very informative and entertaining at the same time. You covered about 100 years of time from the Civil War through the Vietnam War, and the arc of how women served and were treated in the military, and how people of color served and were treated in the military. As we're here in the 2020s, is there more to be done for women and for people of color in the service? And then I have a follow-up question.
Yes.
And what would that be? If I can put you on the spot.
Yeah, what would that be? Yeah, well, if I knew the answer and had a solution, I wouldn't be standing here. I have another position. But, really, I think about what my 5th grade teacher taught me, the preamble to the Constitution: we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. And a more perfect means that it's never going to be perfect. And it's weird that our founding fathers knew that. And, we celebrate 250 years, and we're still very young as a nation. And so I fall back on from the lessons that I, learned from the 6888. We show people what we can do instead of telling them. I mean, the conversations have to be had, and that's where the storytelling becomes involved, because the odds, and that's a section, the working title of my book, just to let you know, was The Odds Ain't Good, But Good Stuff Happens. And the part 3 was less than a 3% chance. Most people thought that I was from another planet when I said, yeah, I think I'm gonna try to get Congress to sign this legislation and heal staffers and, well, to approve the legislation for presidential signature. They said, bless your heart, you just have no idea what you're doing, do you? I'm like, probably not, but at least I can try. So by telling these stories, it motivates people to step outside their comfort zones and to work toward that more perfect. And so the 6888, the 2 post offices that we got Congress to agree on, and we got legislation signed by the president. I said, we, the 6888 grassroots community, we are able to defy odds and show what's possible. And so if each person, entity, or group who has that passion, has a purpose, engage in the storytelling, and just move forward with that. And you may not get that 100%, but you work toward that more perfect, because you step back and say, all right, yeah, it's pretty bad sometimes, but where is it good? Just pick a place. And that's that's a rhetorical question, by the way. And that's why the women from the 6888, this is our home. So we're going to do our part to take care of our home.
Well, here's another then broad question,
Okay.
a little bit broader, but I know the amount of research you had to do, looking everywhere, sometimes productive research, sometimes dead ends. But you've covered about 100 years, and we're living history today. Of the 7 women that were survivors of that unit and that were celebrated in your film, one of them said her regret was that so many others did not live to see that recognition.
Right.
So living in the 2020s, I'm wondering if you have ever wondered what group is out there today serving the country in the military, either in the military or associated with the military, that deserves more recognition, that isn't getting it today, but might be recognized in 70 years from now?
That is a very good question, because we are such a blended society now. And even though it seems like we are isolated by, in different segments, that's a hard question. I just don't have an answer. I think it's more about the legacy, not of a particular group, but of the combined efforts and the outcome. So what outcomes have occurred in this era, in this year, in 2026, that are so impactful that will impact future generations? And I don't have the answer to that.
Well, then I'll follow up with a comment.
Okay.
Whatever happens during the next 60 or 70 years to change society, your research and your story is going to be part of the push.
Oh,
So
well,
congratulations.
thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I think that's all of them, but
Okay.
thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I have a few books, if you would like to purchase a book, no pressure. I just, I was told to bring some, so that's what I did. So Sarah, I turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Cummings. This is meaningful, and it's at the heart of the kinds of issues and questions and history that Sotterley needs to explore. And we want to have you back soon. We'll give you a real special tour too. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being online with us. I want to remind you that Sotterley exists today because of the support of folks like you. And we're happy to take your support, and we will put it to good use. We hope you'll watch your mail, watch our website, sotterley.org, for upcoming events. We've got a great slate of activities coming up, but also remember, we're open Friday, Saturday, Sunday. The grounds are open every day, and Catherine ensures that we have the best tours you will ever see of all of our historic property. So thank you for coming, and we hope to see you again real soon.